So we're at the last session of the day, and I'm pretty sure you agree with me that we have heard about impressive accomplishments from a wide variety of speakers. No, then we will not have a break. So the break is going to be just a brief, sweet talk. I am going to improvise here to transition to the next session. So we have heard about what researchers are doing right now to address challenges that we have faced for many years in different domains. I know that maybe my voice is not very refreshing, but what we want to do now is, once we have heard what is essential to do right now for different domains in astronomy, high energy physics, multi-messenger astrophysics, we now want to transition into the future. What can we do to develop better algorithms? How can we harness innovation in extreme scale computing, in edge devices, as Matthew Graham was talking about, which are also essential for MMA and high energy physics. So we are going to start with one project that is quite exciting. It is the Event Horizon Telescope, and we want to hear from Katie Bouman about how they are harnessing innovation in AI and innovative computing to take us from the current state of affairs to the future. So Katie, please take it away.
Great. Yeah, so thanks for inviting me to speak today to you about some of the stuff that we're doing. I'm going to tell you a little bit about work that we've done over the past couple of years for the Event Horizon Telescope, and then also kind of tell you what we're doing towards the future and building the next generation of the array and how we're using machine learning to help with that. So before getting into the Event Horizon Telescope, I just kind of want to introduce more generally what my work is on. And so, many things that we wish to take pictures of, we can actually see with our own eyes. And using a kind of standard camera, we can produce an image that looks like the scene we want to capture. But in many cases, what we want to image is actually invisible to us. So for instance, we can't take a picture of our brain using a standard camera. And in these cases, since it's impossible to directly image the thing we want to see, we develop alternative ways to take indirect measurements. For instance, using an MRI scanner. And since the measurements don't look anything like the images we're trying to capture, we design algorithms that work with the new sensing system in order to recover the desired picture. And so I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this methodology, and I've worked on this kind of computational imaging methodology in a number of different domains. But today I'm going to focus mostly on telling you a little bit about how we've been able to use this methodology to reveal what I think of as the ultimate invisible, and that's black holes. So black holes are one of the most mysterious, things in our universe, and scientists have been studying them ever since they were first predicted by Einstein's theory of general relativity just over 100 years ago. And in particular, for decades, scientists have really been interested in studying the giant elliptical galaxy at the head of the Virgo constellation, which is called M87. And this galaxy is 55 million light years away from us, and very special because over 100 years ago, someone actually discovered a streak of light on the sky, which ended up being this galactic scale jet of plasma that was shooting out of the core of the galaxy and marking the spot of a supermassive black hole. And so over decades, scientists tried to develop better and better instruments to study the supermassive black hole to predict it to be at the center. And then in April of 2017, we hooked up this Earth-sized telescope and collected the data necessary to make this first picture of the black hole. And it took 2 years of processing to get to that. So hopefully some machine learning stuff that I'll talk about will help also in expediting that. But this ring is a signature of the black hole's event horizon. But since it is so far away from us, it appears incredibly small in the sky. It's about the same size as a grain of sand, but if that grain of sand is in New York and I'm viewing it from Caltech in California. And so taking this picture required an international collaboration of scientists from around the world, building new instruments and algorithms to make it possible. And so today I want to tell you just a very abridged story of how we were able to take a picture of a black hole. And then in the second half, I'm going to tell you a little bit about techniques that we're currently developing at Caltech to build the next generation of this telescope that will allow us to see environments around black holes that are still invisible to us. Okay, so going back to, this is really, really small. And because the ring is so small, and we have to observe it at a very particular wavelength, diffraction limits required a telescope 13 million meters across, or essentially the size of the Earth. And although we couldn't build a single dish telescope the size of the Earth, the Event Horizon Telescope collaboration joined telescopes from around the world to build a computational telescope the size of the Earth that's capable of resolving structure on the scale of a black hole's event horizon for the first time. And so how does this work? Well, unlike with a camera, the Event Horizon Telescope doesn't capture the picture in pixel space, but instead in its frequency space. So it essentially is taking measurements of the black hole image's Fourier transform. And if we covered the globe in telescopes, then we'd sample all the spatial frequency measurements we'd need to make an image. But since we only have telescopes at a few locations, that means we only get a sparse number of measurements. And so it turns out that for every 2 telescopes in the array, we obtain a single complex measurement of the underlying image's 2D spatial frequency that's related to the projected baseline between the telescopes. In 2017, the Event Horizon Telescope observed with 8 different telescopes, but actually only 5 of them were able to see M87 and were at distinct locations. So with the EHT's 5 telescopes, that would be 5 choose 2, which is only 10 points that we'd have to try to make an image from, which is an incredibly small number of points. But we get lucky, and that's because as the Earth is rotating, we obtain other new measurements. So since the baselines between telescopes change as the Earth rotates, this amounts to carving out these different elliptical paths in the spatial frequency plane, where telescopes that are close together are telling you about large spatial structure. And so to get the fine detail we have to put our telescopes far apart. And so at this point, we can abstract away a lot of astrophysics and look at it as purely this mathematical computational imaging problem. We have the sparse data, and our challenge is to find the image that caused it. And if we were given measurements that covered the entire frequency plane, we could just simply invert the data back in the case of no noise to get an image. But since we only see a few samples, there's an infinite number of possible images that are consistent with the sparse data we measure. And on top of that, the fact that there's a different quickly changing atmosphere above each telescope causes our data to be really noisy and makes the problem even more ill-posed. So I like to give a bit of a sense of how this noise looks like because it informs kind of how we go about the reconstruction task. So the whole reason the Event Horizon Telescope or radio interferometry works in the first place is due to the fact that light from the black hole is going to travel to Earth for 55 million years, and then it's going to reach one of the telescopes just slightly before the other one. And that time delay is key for extracting the 2D spatial frequency measurements that we use for image reconstruction. But when you have one telescope in Chile and one in Hawaii and one in Spain, they all have different atmospheres above them. And each atmosphere causes a random phase delay in the signal. And so this adds a different propagation delay, which introduces a phase delay in our measurement. And similarly, it also causes a different attenuation factor, which changes the absolute gain term as well. And so this error becomes really challenging because although we would measure ideally this nice, beautiful Fourier component, the italicized V on the right, in reality, we have a completely random phase error and sometimes a pretty bad amplitude error as well. And so that's pretty terrible because at first glance, you've lost both your amplitude and your phase information. And so if you've lost both amplitude and phase, what do you have to go off of? And it turns out that we do because these errors are site-based. So every measurement we make, remember, comes from 2 telescopes. And so if we have a third telescope, then the measurements that are formed with that third telescope actually share the same corrupting terms, G2 and Phi2, that came from the first 2 telescopes. And so we design imaging algorithms that take advantage of this redundant corruption when solving for our images. So essentially, if we're solving a constrained phase retrieval problem, our amplitude is usually not as bad as our phase, but our phase is terrible, but we solve for a phase under these kind of constraints. So even though with these data constraints, we still have the infinite solutions problem that I referred to earlier, but of the images that are consistent with the measured data, there are some that are more likely than others. And so thus our goal becomes to find an image that doesn't just fit the data, under these kind of constraints we've outlined, but also is likely under some sort of model of what likely images look like by using just image regularizers and priors. And so using this idea, we developed a number of different techniques to tackle the Event Horizon Telescope data that spanned both from more traditional algorithms to more modern kind of approaches. But one thing to note is that even if we could develop, methods to recover a single image, even though we developed a lot of new techniques to deal with this challenging data, any method that we developed, whether it's a traditional approach or a fancy new machine learning approach, always is going to have to require that we inject some additional information into the problem about what images look like to recover something back in the end. And so that always is biasing our final picture. And we didn't want to, for instance, have a preference for ring images and then be really excited we recovered a ring back in the end. So we had to be very careful when making images. And we therefore tackled the imaging through a multi-step process that included many synthetic data tests, strict blind imaging procedures, and then objective learning of imaging parameters through the very simple machine learning kind of ideas, very simplified. But these tests took a long time to complete. I just kind of want to talk through a little bit at the end so you can kind of see one example of the kinds of tests that we did. So I said that we developed a number of different kind of imaging methods. So here were 3 pipelines that we did develop, and each of these pipelines involves different hyperparameters. And these hyperparameters are usually selected by a human user, but instead of a human tuning them, we wanted to instead search for the best set of knobs to recover different kind of source structures. So for instance, we would generate synthetic data as if the Event Horizon Telescope were actually seeing a disk on the sky that had no hole in the center. And then we found the best parameters to recover this disk shape. And then when we transferred these exact parameters onto the M87 data, although we had chosen parameters to try our hardest at recovering a disk, we found that the data in our algorithms still required us to put a hole in the center. And so by doing this simple machine learning, very simple machine learning kind of training testing procedure on many different types of underlying sources, and then finding all of the parameters that gave us reasonable results, we saw that our methods always kind of preferred this ring shape. And that was true no matter the day we observed M87 on, because we observed it over 4 days, or the imaging code that we used to reconstruct it. And so we blurred then these images from different pipelines to an equivalent resolution, and then averaged them to form the image that we showed everyone last year, this ring of light surrounding the black hole. So a lot of people ask, why is it so blurry? And one is that we have an intrinsic resolution that we can't get past, and another is we want to gave an image that had the kind of confidence in the features that we're showing. And so this is kind of a merging of different methods, actually, this image. So this image tells us so much about the immediate environment around a black hole. But perhaps one of the most amazing things is that by comparing this picture to simulations scientists have made for years, we find that the image we've taken is actually amazingly consistent with a number of these predictions. But you might have noticed actually the simulation I just showed you was moving. So is our recovered M87 image also moving? And it turns out actually it is. So another interesting thing is I said that we observed M87 over 4 nights. So if you independently reconstruct an image from each of those 4 nights that was taken over the span of a week, and you string them together, you actually notice there's some variation, some evolution. So I'll play it for you here. It's pretty hard to see, so I'm going to play it again. You'll see the brightness kind of moves more from the left to the bottom right, maybe. Play it again. So we don't know exactly what this evolution is caused by, whether it's material rotating or just filaments getting brighter and dimmer. But what we are really sure of is the black hole is evolving. And that's because it appears in the raw measurements we take. And actually getting a hold on a black hole's time variability is quite important for a number of reasons. It doesn't only just give us a window into the dynamics around a black hole and hopefully an understanding of how their powerful jets are forming, but it also helps us in mapping the space-time of a black hole and constraining our prediction of gravity, general relativity even further. But actually, the black hole in M87 is not the only black hole we're interested in imaging to get a handle on the question of time variability. Actually, in the heart of our own Milky Way galaxy, 26,000 light years away from us, there is a cluster of stars. And by peering past all the galactic dust with infrared telescopes, astronomers have mapped the paths of this cluster of stars over decades. And these stars seem to orbit this invisible object. And by tracking the motion of stars over time, astronomers have concluded that the only thing small and dense enough to cause this motion is a supermassive black hole. And in fact, this led to the Nobel Prize in Physics just given weeks ago for the work of Andrea Ghez and Reinhard Genzel for the discovery of the supermassive compact object at the center of our galaxy, otherwise known as Sagittarius A star. And so as awesome as M87 has been, Sagittarius A star, or Sag A star for short, might be able to help us better answer these questions. And so M87 actually is an enormous black hole. It's about 6.5 billion solar masses, and Sag A star is teeny tiny compared to M87, only a measly 4 million solar masses. But because it's so much closer to us, it appears about the same size on the sky. But since it's so small, that means the gas orbits around it much more quickly. So for Sag A star, the gas can make a complete orbit every 4 to 30 minutes. And so we'd like to be able to image the time variations around Sag A star. And to do that, we've been developing methods to try to recover not just static images from the data, but actually full movies. But if you thought recovering a static image was hard, ill-posed problem, then this is orders of magnitude more challenging. We have to solve for the pixels in a full movie rather than just a single frame. And so as important as it is to continue pushing on the algorithmic approaches to squeeze more out of the data, we've also are realizing that it's important not just to improve on algorithms, but also the instrument that collects the data to begin with. And so that leads to the last part of the talk today on using machine learning for optimal telescope design or optimized telescope design. So in 2017, I said we only observed with telescopes at 6 different locations, and making an image was really challenging with that small number of measurements. Although in the end we were confident, it took us over a year to build that confidence. And so we have been building out our array to get more data, adding telescopes in Greenland, France, Arizona, and the one I'm most excited about is we recently got funding to add a telescope at Caltech's Owens Valley Radio Observatory. But what could we do if we added 10 more? Well, maybe we could be able to not just make an image, but capture a video of the gas falling into the black hole in the center of our Milky Way. And so, as I said, being able to do this would be a huge scientific gold mine. But before we just plop down a bunch of telescopes, we need to be really careful because building a new telescope is expensive, at least millions, but usually tens of millions of dollars. And so we really should try to optimize and find the locations that give us the biggest bang for our buck. So how should we go about solving for the location of telescopes in our next generation array? Well, typically the design of the sensor, like the telescope array, is idealized and considered independently from the image reconstruction problem. And in doing so, many assumptions are made, for instance, ignoring nonlinearities in the system or complexities in the noise. But for problems where the data is so correlated and the noise is so challenging, like the Event Horizon Telescope, the sensing system and imaging algorithms are so intimately related that we really should be trying to optimize them jointly. And so how should we go about doing this? Well, if you rearrange the blocks in this diagram, you'll notice that it looks very similar to an autoencoder, where the sensing system is the encoder that produces the measurements or codes, and the imaging algorithm is the decoder. And as you all know, deep encoders, where the encoder and decoder are neural networks, are often used for image compression, where you're solving for the encoder and decoder simultaneously. And in the Event Horizon Telescope, the telescope array is kind of acting as the encoder, the codes represent measurements, and the image reconstruction method acts as the decoder. And so in the reconstruction problem, you could just use an arbitrary mathematical function that takes you from the measurements to an image for the reconstruction. And so we could use a neural network for the decoder. But unlike a generic deep encoder, sensing systems that we build must obey physical constraints. And so we can't just use an arbitrary neural network for the encoder because it has to be something that once we've defined, we have to be able to build it. And so I've recently been working on this problem at Caltech with my postdoc Hassan, who has been leading this effort. And the approach that we propose is to develop a physics-constrained encoder that we can train with the decoder end-to-end. So let's zoom into exactly what we're doing. So from some input image, we can define a forward model of the measurements that we expect to collect. In this example, we pretended to have 3 possible telescopes color-coded by blue, red, and green. And this indicates the measurements that come from the telescopes as the colored dots. And so these measurements can be complicated, nonlinear, correlated, and noisy. And here we're showing all the possible samples. So we could pass them all off to the decoder, the image reconstruction method, but then we'd actually have to build them all, right? So our goal is to choose among them. And to do that, we introduce what we call sensor sampling distribution that characterizes the probability that we sample from a particular telescope. And we sample telescopes from this distribution and then mask out the ones that were not produced by those telescopes. And so every time we sample, we get different combinations of telescopes, obtain different measurements, and then pass these off to the decoder for image reconstruction. So we can string all the pieces together into the single differentiable network with the trainable blocks highlighted in red. And our ultimate goal is to use this network to learn an optimized probability distribution of telescopes that we think are best to build. And we do that by maximizing the similarity between the input and output images. We also want to reduce sparsity, encourage sparsity to reduce the number of telescopes we build. And then we also added a loss term to encourage sampling diversity so that we make sure we're exploring the space of possibilities. And then we learn the sensor sampling distribution parameters during end-to-end training at the same time as learning the image reconstruction decoder method. And so just to give a sense, we model our sensor sampling distribution as a binary, fully connected IC model, binary Markov random field that indicates which sensors we should turn off and on and how the sensors are correlated. And then we learn these parameters theta during end-to-end training. And so here's an example of a telescope distribution we've learned. The IC model parameters theta jj on the left quantify the activity or importance, and the model parameters theta jk on the right quantify correlation between pairs of telescopes. And from the recovered distributions, we can see some patterns we expect to see. So for instance, in the case of uncorrelated noise, the co-located telescopes are heavily penalized from sampling together because they're just sampling the exact same data. But my favorite is not the things we'd expect to see, but the things we don't know we expect. So for instance, by changing the type of noise we train on, we can see how this affects our results. So for instance, this result is with purely Gaussian thermal noise included. But when we include the difficult atmospheric phase air that plagues our measurements, the array preferences change fairly drastically. And notice that when I flip back and forth, the correlations have changed, and we find that this tells us about structures that are preferred in the case of this more challenging data correlations. And so I'm really excited that we're able to handle these more complicated cases now and learn from them and help inform how we build the future of our array. But perhaps, for instance, our goal is not just image reconstruction. Let's say our goal is to extract some feature or classify some black hole property. Well, then we could just, switch out the reconstruction method with a classifier and also kind of learn the differences in the arrays and what it prefers in these different tasks.
Okay, Katie, can you wrap up?
Yeah, sorry, I'm on my last slides now. So using this approach, we're starting to understand where we might be placing our next base telescopes to reveal more. And we're even talking about optimizing the placement of telescopes in space. Also, just want to mention that this method is very general, not just for black hole imaging, but this going back to the beginning, we have this same the synergy between instruments and algorithms in lots of different problems. And so we've been using the same kind of method for medical imaging, microscopic imaging, and improving the patterns we use for these kind of sensing problems. And so hopefully we can use machines to help us develop optimized cameras that exceed limitations of traditional theory and recover more information from them. And so with that, thank you, and I look forward to later answering any questions you have. Thanks. Sorry for going a little over.
It's okay, Katie. Thanks a lot. So we're going to have the questions now, and we have time for
okay,
one.
we have questions now.
Yeah, let's have one question at this time, and just open the mic and go ahead, please.
So thank you, Katie. That was an amazing talk. I just wanted to ask, is there, are you considering different choices of basis functions, for example, wavelets rather than just pixels, or is that taken
Yeah.
into account?
Yeah, so in the original image M87 paper, at least we looked over a lot of different kinds of image regularizers. Some of those are doing, actually in the ones that we ended up publishing, I don't think there were any wavelet ones because we wanted to simplify the list. But we looked over lots of different kinds of image regularizers and then kind of saw which ones met a cutoff based upon synthetic data tests, and then just looked at the variations in the images across using those different types of regularizers. We found that we had more sophisticated machine learning kind of methods for regularization, and we had explored wavelet ones, but we ended up not including those because it was kind of unnecessary. They all kind of, for that problem at least, they all kind of converge to this ring structure. But for the more challenging Sagittarius star data in the future, I think this is one thing that we're going to need to explore more. And one thing that I've been also working with HUT on is more efficient posterior estimation for different kinds of learned priors.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you, Katie. It was a very impressive talk. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for inviting me.